I'm going to light our chalice with these matches that are explosive, but they're the only. Oh, that one behaved. Oh no, there's some fireworks in these matches. And we light our chalice, a symbol of our faith, our community, a community that says every week in our covenant. What do we say in our covenant? Oh, what's our covenant? Help me out. We say
seek the truth in freedom.
What's the first part? We covenant.
From all that dwell below the skies.
No, that's the doxology. Come on. This is horrible. We're going to cut this out too.
To dwell together in
peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help one another.
That's it.
You're right.
Love is the spirit of this church. And service is its prayer.
This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help one another.
Yeah, exactly. So love is the spirit of this church, and spirit is its prayer, and service is its prayer. So love and service, like right in the beginning of what we say every week. So to serve with love is this beautiful opportunity to talk about some of what that looks like. And so we are particularly thrilled to have our own resident poet, whose official name in published form is a little different than we know him. Most of us know him as Bob, but it's Robert Lavett Smith. Is that how you pronounce your middle name?
Yes, you got it right. Hardly anybody ever does.
And so I thought what we would do tonight is, Bob and I have talked before tonight, so I have some questions to ask. I think I'm going to put us on speaker view, and which, at least my version, and ask you some questions, and then we'll take a moment later and people can also follow up with questions. And so because what we're talking about tonight is poetry and the sonnet, what I first wanted to ask you, Bob, is how you fell into loving and writing poetry.
Well, I think that it was a combination of a couple things. It goes way back to when I was in middle school, about 1971. And I had always been really interested in the singer-songwriters of the 60s and 70s, but particularly Paul Simon, who's my biggest favorite. But I knew that I wasn't musical at all. And I was sort of looking for something that I could do that would allow me a similar outlet. And poetry, in a way, I think is closer to song lyrics than other kinds of writing. The other story, which I've told many times, but it probably bears retelling, is that I really decided to write poetry one day in 7th grade French class when I was caught passing a love note to a beautiful girl. And the teacher read it to the class, hoping to humiliate me. And instead, I wound up thinking, this is really cool. I can do this. And just for the record, predictably, I did not get the girl. Let's see, from then on in in 1971, which is just a little over half a century ago, I made the mistake of announcing to my family that I had decided to write poetry. And my mother, who is still going strong at 94, is one of these stern, sort of sour, small-town Midwestern women who can throw a wet blanket over anything. And she said, well, I suppose everybody goes through that poetry phase. And the result of this was that instead of saying, no, I'm serious about this, she always told me she knew me better than I knew myself. So I thought, my God, I'm going to lose it. I have to hurry. And I've been writing at least one poem a day, and usually 2 or 3 for more than 2 years now, including 3 that I wrote today. But I think part of that kind of commitment comes from the fact that even after half a century, I'm still that scared kid trying to outrun the end of the poetry phase. In the meantime, my mom by now has decided I'm serious about it. When I had health issues that caused me to need to retire earlier than I had expected, she said, "But wouldn't you like to just be able to write all day?" And I had to admit I would like that, and that's pretty much what I've been doing.
So do you want to talk a little bit, when you and I talked, it seems like you've had a journey through and in relationship to various forms. And do you want to talk a little bit about that journey again?
Sure. This is an interesting journey. My mother was of a generation, she was born in the 1920s, where she insisted that if it didn't rhyme, it wasn't poetry. But in the modern poetry community, in terms of getting published in magazines and so on, there's a kind of a feeling that if it does rhyme, it isn't poetry. So there's a heavy bias toward free verse, no meter, no rhyme. And what happened to me was that when I started writing, when I was in middle school and through high school, I was doing the sickeningly sweet kind of hokey high school love poems, all of which I've still got in the apartment somewhere here, but you will not find them. However, what happened was that when I went to college, I realized that nobody was writing rhymed verse, and I switched to free verse, which served me well from my late teens until about 10 years ago when I was in my mid-50s. And then I hit a terrible writer's block. It had never happened before. And essentially, I was writing every day, but I was getting nothing that I thought was of any value at all for about 2 years. And one night I had the bright idea that maybe I needed to kind of, because I'd been writing for 40 years at that point, I needed to sort of reinvigorate my writing process. So I switched back to writing rhymed poetry because I assumed that I had grown enough as both a person and a writer since I was a teenager, that if I, in my mid-50s, started writing in rhyme again, it would be, God help us, I hoped at least a little better than what I'd written as a teenager. And I started with the sonnet because the sonnet had always intrigued me. And it's useful to me to this day because I guess this deromanticizes poetry a little bit, and I don't really mean to, but what happens is that if I sit down and I get that iambic pentameter rhythm going in my head, ba-bump, 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 it becomes kind of like working a puzzle. I'm not much of a one for puzzles otherwise, but sort of like doing a crossword or a Sudoku, you start to be able to fill things in to the pattern. And I try out various possible opening lines until I hit something that I think will work. And from there, I know more or less how to get the sonnet down, at least to a point where I have a complete draft where I can revise, switch out images and lines for things that I think are stronger. But that was it. I started writing rhymed poetry as a kid. I gave it up for about 40 years with good reason. And then to kind of break myself out of a rut, I went back to it, and it's been useful to me ever since.
Lovely. So I'm not sure everybody remembers the form of a sonnet, from wherever we learned it, potentially as far back as middle school. So can you just take us back through what is this form that you have fallen in love with?
Yes. There are several different kinds of sonnets. And basically, one thing that we know for sure is that a sonnet is always a poem of 14 lines. It is usually rhymed and has a specific rhythm. In English, that rhythm is iambic pentameter, as I just said. In other languages, it's different. The sonnet line is longer in French. It's iambic hexameter, which has 2 more beats. So the iambic pentameter in English would be, well, like the Shakespeare poem we're going to look at later, let me not to the marriage of true minds, ba-bump, 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 ba-bump. And in a French sonnet, I'm thinking of a famous sonnet from the Renaissance by the poet Pierre de Ronsard. You get the line, Ronsard me célébrait du temps que j'étais belle. Ronsard me célébrait du temps que j'étais belle. 2 more beats. And the reason for that is that the iambic pentameter rhythm comes close to the usual rhythm of normal speech in English. And the Alexandrine or iambic hexameter is closer to the normal rhythm of French speech, which is why they use a different one. Now, the rhyme scheme is interesting because most sonnets are rhymed, and they have several possible rhyme schemes depending upon what style you're writing. The oldest one is known as the Petrarchan sonnet or the Italian sonnet. And I don't know if anybody knows how to figure out a rhyme scheme. If you're looking at a rhyme scheme of a poem, you call your first line A, and if the next line does not rhyme with it, it's B. And then if the next line rhymes with neither of those, it's C. So for the Petrarchan sonnet, the rhyme scheme is A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, C, D, C, D. And it was originally written in Italian. The thing about that is the structure of the Italian language, I understand, and I don't speak Italian myself, allows for a lot more rhymes and rhymes to come a lot more easily. Now, the Shakespearean sonnet, which is the one that's most usually used in English, also known as the English sonnet, is rhymed A-B, A-B, C-D, C-D, E-F, E-F, with a concluding couplet, G, G. And the advantage here, because this is in English and there are relatively few rhymes in English, is that each line in that sonnet has to rhyme with only one other line. So it gives you a lot more maneuverability. And that concluding couplet, G, G, 2 lines that rhyme with each other, is used like a summing up. In fact, and this really will demythologize poetry, but if you think about when you were in college and you were told how to write an essay with various different things happening at various points, within the 14 lines of the sonnet, the same thing happens. In the Shakespearean sonnet, each time that rhyme scheme changes every 4 lines, you're supposed to be introducing another aspect of your topic. And then those 2 lines at the end that rhyme with each other, that concluding rhymed couplet, is a summing up or kind of like the moral of the story.
That's fascinating. So I don't know if you said this, you said you've been writing poetry, but did you say that you have been writing a sonnet in the right? You have been since January 1st of what, 2021?
Well, no, actually, since probably, I think, the middle of December of 2019, a month or so after I retired, I've been writing at least 1 poem a day. Usually one of those is a sonnet, and the reason for that is because I can fill in the structure of a sonnet. If I sat down and decided to write a free verse poem every day, I would lose my mind because I don't necessarily have really good ideas every day. So I start with a sonnet because I can kind of get that rhythm going in my head and just see where it takes me. And then very often after I've finished the sonnet, I will have warmed up enough to be able to do a free verse poem or two, maybe even a second sonnet. Sometimes I also do the villanelle, which is a French form from the Renaissance that involves repeated lines that recur in a certain order in a 19-line poem. Those are harder. I've written a few of them that are good, but I'm better at the sonnet, and I have a lot more sonnets.
So when we were talking tonight, and originally I had said, well, before we even picked this night, I had said that it would be great if you could share a couple of your favorite sonnets. And the two that you picked ended up both being love sonnets. And one is Shakespearean and one is one that you wrote, which is why we're doing the program tonight, because how could we beat it, doing love sonnets on Valentine's? So do you have those in front of you? Or are you able to?
I do have them in front of me
memory?
before I read them. Let me say that in the history of the sonnet, traditionally the form for the first 2 or 3 centuries was a love poem. And what has happened is that in modern sonnets, the form has caught on enough that you can now use a sonnet to talk about anything. But originally it was a love poem, and that made it seem appropriate for Valentine's Day. So let's see. Oh, come on. I had it. Here it is. I'm going to do this the way that I set this up, which probably puts me at a disadvantage because I was going to read the Shakespeare poem first and then have to, kind of follow that act. But let's do it. The Shakespeare poem is one of the better known, and his sonnets, I believe there are 164 or something like that, are all numbered. This is Sonnet 116. Listen every few lines for the slight change in subject matter if you can. Sonnet 116 by William Shakespeare. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out under the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. I do not know when that was written. I could have looked it up. I just didn't think to do it. I would say sometime in the late 15 or early 1600s, that the turn of the 17th century being when Shakespeare was most active. I actually had that on a T-shirt once years ago. Anyway, in the style of the 17th century, Shakespeare's sonnet talks about love in general terms. And did you notice that that concluding couplet summing things up? If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. Now, my sonnet, on the other hand, is much more specific because in general, whatever form I'm using, I tend to write more specifically. And this is called Dollhouse, in memory of Patricia Lewis Smith, 1953 to 2005. The tiny rooms, immaculately furnished, stood for the home we never could afford. The roll-top desk, the copper cookware burnished and hanging neatly, each embroidered word on the stamp-sized sampler hung above the couch, the bed with its bright quilt. In miniature were gathered here the dreams she could not touch. Her dollhouse dreams brought out the best in her. These days her ashes stain a windowsill no larger than a matchbook. She is gone, but in these things she loved there lingers still some essence rescued from oblivion. Each elfin fixture resonates with loss, and grief's the only tenant of this house.
So that was written for your wife who passed away.
Yes.
And do you want to say a little bit more about the dollhouse? Is that a literal dollhouse, or is it all
is a
metaphor?
Literal dollhouse. I no longer have it. I forget why I no longer have it. I could have kept it, but I didn't. And I forget whether it was because we gave it to Pat's niece or what. I. It was a literal dollhouse, and she worked as I did as a paraprofessional for the school district, and would often come home feeling, kind of burnt out at the end of the day, as I did too. And she was walking home one day along Clement Street and went past a store that made custom-made furniture, and there was a dollhouse in there. And she went in and she bought it. And then there was another place at Clement and I think Presidio, which was called the Hobby Company. And when Pat really felt that she needed something to give her a lift after a particularly difficult day, she would go into the Hobby Company and she would buy a piece of furniture for this dollhouse. Now, the dollhouse itself was not like the elaborate ones you sometimes see. It was fairly plain. It had been made of thick, probably pine, about yay thick. And it didn't have a whole lot of detail, but what really gave the dollhouse life was the way that she furnished the various rooms. And I know that in the last few years of her life, this is something that gave her enormous pleasure. Revisiting this poem, I found myself really wondering why I didn't keep the dollhouse myself. But that was more than 16 years ago, and at the time, there was a reason why I didn't. It may have simply been that it reminded me so much of her that I didn't want it around. But anyway, it is a literal dollhouse. You, Vanessa, I think, own a book of mine called Smoke in Cold Weather, which is a collection of sonnets.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I do.
And at the time that was published, I really wanted the dollhouse poem to be part of it, but I had attempted it several times and none of them felt right, so it didn't make it into that book. It's in my subsequent book, which is called The Widower Considers Candles, which has one section that's devoted to sonnets. I really always wished that had made it into Smoke and Cold Weather, but it just wasn't done.
So I'm tempted to go two ways. One is that I have a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
And the other is that if people have burning questions about the two poems, and it's going to, you're going to get agita if you don't ask them, which I would totally understand, then I think we could also take a minute to ask questions.
They don't look especially agitated to me. What do you think?
Okay. I can only see a few people because I'm looking at you in writ large. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and then we can go back and we can even reread those poems if people want to hear them again. I guess, one of the other questions I wanted to ask you is kind of what is your process? Like, how do you write a sonnet? You said a little bit about that already. It doesn't sound like you wait for the muse to strike, which can be kind of a stereotype about the artist or the writer, right?
That's true. I don't. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. My parents were, both of them, the sort of people who were beyond type A. When I was a kid, you had to be in motion every single instant. You had to be doing something. And when I was first working at a bookstore in New York and living with my parents before I found a place of my own in Hoboken, New Jersey, that's where I found the place, not where I was living with my parents. But my dad came into my room one night and he said, if you're going to work low-level jobs so that you can be a writer, I damn well expect you to be seated at that typewriter writing all evening, every night. And I tried to explain to him that a certain amount of this was inspiration and that I couldn't necessarily just decide to write constantly. And fast forward almost 50 years to the present day, I've gotten to the point where I've been doing this enough that I can just decide to write. And some days go better than others.
You said in the beginning that a sonnet, when you and I were talking last time, that a sonnet took you in the beginning 9 to 10 hours. It doesn't take you 9 to 10 hours to write one anymore.
No, not at all. Back about 10 years ago when I first started, they were a little clumsier because I wasn't used to the form. But I think I took about 10 hours the first time I tried to do a Spenserian sonnet, which is a variant of the Shakespearean, which involves a few more rhymes. Actually, each of those quatrains, the first line of the next quatrain rhymes with the line right before it, so you have to rhyme a little bit more. And I used to work in those days in the Sunset Branch Library a few blocks from where I lived to get myself out of the house. And I remember I went in there one afternoon and I was there until they closed at 9 at night, still trying to get the Spenserian sonnet to work. Nowadays, I can write a sonnet in somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. I usually have a rough draft with all the rhymes pretty much in place at the end of the first hour. And then I hit a stage which I refer to as putting the poetry into it, which is where you have a draft of a sonnet or of some other poem, and it makes sense and it fits whatever pattern you've chosen, but you think, really, for this to ignite, for this to take off, I need to have some of these images or lines be stronger and more surprising than they are. And then I go through and I spend the second hour or so staring at the thing and wondering what I can change to strengthen the lines, and I usually do.
Lovely. So I want to go from maybe the focused in on process and then throw the focus as far back in some ways as it can go, a little bit, at least within the personal, and ask you, if you've given and are giving so much of your life and love to poetry and in particular to the sonnet, at least right now. So what is do you think, what is the magic and purpose of poetry? Because I can't believe you're giving yourself to it because you think it's a frivolous thing. So what is the magic?
No, it's definitely not a frivolous thing. And in the course of 50 years of attempting to be a poet, I have run into hundreds of people who either dislike poetry because they think it's a secret language that they've been closed out of somehow, or say that they simply never understand poetry. Or when I was teaching French at a high school in New Jersey way back in the early 80s, something was said about poetry, and one of my students said, "But why not just say that?" And I think that poetry's function is twofold. It situates us in the world by using language in a more intense way than we normally do in conversation, so that it forces us to really look at things. I would say that's the first function of poetry. The second function of poetry is to, by implication, hint at subtleties that it really isn't possible to just come right out and say, things that are a little too tenuous to just state. Does that help at all?
Yes, it does. It does. That it teases out nuance, allows you, and that it brings you into the present is the way I would restate it. In some ways,
yes, I think those are good restatements.
In some ways, to me, it's like it pulls you into life, right?
Yeah, it should.
Immediacy, it's subtlety.
I think all art should allow us in its way to live more vividly and more immediately.
Yeah, what did you say? You said in high school you had an English teacher whose favorite definition of poetry was in a book that you used.
This was kind of something that came out of the 60s, and I think it's absolute garbage. But one of my high school teachers used to love to quote a supposed definition of poetry, which I don't know who said it. Someday maybe they'll be forgiven. But the quote was, "Poetry is an impish attempt to paint the colors of the wind." And while you could argue that that might stand as a poem in its own right, as a definition, it's absolute garbage. It tells you nothing. And I totally didn't buy into that then, and I still don't.
Good. So, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
Okay. So I thought now let's open it up for questions or reflections or thoughts that that folks who have been so respectfully listening might have. And I guess you can do that by just like raising a literal hand or...
they look for all the world like they're actually paying attention.
I know, they do. They do. Do people agree with that definition? Oh, go ahead, Marty. Star King, I mean.
I was just going to ask Bob, on a personal level, what are your feelings when you write? Both when you sit down and face a blank piece of paper, and how do you feel when you've completed a poem that works for you?
Well, because I was housebound by an injury about 2 years before the pandemic started, I have been indoors for an awfully long time. And, well, you and Linda have rescued me occasionally, as has Bill Klingelhofer. But I spent a lot of time by myself. And one thing that I do find is, although nobody's forcing me to try to write every single day, that it provides structure to a life which would be kind of formless and empty without it. And when I'm writing, I'm really focused on doing that and not on the fact that I find so many things just day to day difficult now and that I haven't been out very much, or that Bill's a better chess player than I am, or any of those things. However, I think, one night I was sitting, as I do, recopying a poem I had written into my moleskin notebook. Can you see this? Back view. Anyway, and I was sitting there listening to music. Really, jazz or classical is best for that, instrumental music, because otherwise you start copying down the lyrics instead of what you're trying to recopy. And I was thinking, it's been more than half a century that I've been doing this, but with all of the challenges that life has presented me as I get older, I find that when I'm sitting doing this, I feel like I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm where I'm supposed to be. And in 1971, I sat at a very small desk in a dormer window in our house in Closter, New Jersey, in northern Bergen County, if anybody knows the area. And I would be sitting there sometimes on a Saturday afternoon or late at night on a weeknight, and recopying poems into a notebook. And sometimes when I'm recopying into the moleskin notebooks I use now, I am left with the sense that I've basically been doing this for, a little over half a century, and that it connects me to my own past and to who I've always been at the core to still be doing it. Of course, if my isolated life feels a little bit monastic, it doesn't help that I sit around copying stuff into books. But
I was just thinking that you sounded like a monk. If we could just get you some gilding and you could do some illuminated manuscripts,
Oh, that would be gorgeous. I actually own somewhere one page of an illuminated manuscript from the 1300s. It's rolled up in a tube somewhere in this apartment. It's in Latin. It appears to be from a book of Martyrdom of the Saints, and I bought it when I was living in Paris in 1978 and showed it to a devoutly Catholic poet friend of mine who read Latin. And he looked at it, and he wrinkled up his brow, and he said, "Oh my God, that's disgusting. They wouldn't have done that even in antiquity." And I said, "What does it say?" And he said, "Never mind, I don't want to discuss it." And I never found out.
That's why it was for sale.
There we go.
No one wanted it. They liked the rest of the stories of the saints being martyred, but that one was particularly disturbing, and now you own it.
God only knows what it actually said.
So if people were, I guess I'm curious if you have like a favorite volume of poetry that, is sort of your treasured volume that isn't one of your own,
I think if I had one favorite book out of all the thousands of books that I own, and I wish you could see the apartment because there are stacks of books all around me, and I like it that way. But I think really my favorite book ever is Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. I jokingly tell people that I learned about Walt Whitman when I was a sophomore in high school. I wasn't familiar with his work before that. And section 6 of Song of Myself, which is the one that begins, "A child said, 'What is the grass?' fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he." I jokingly tell people that that's the poem that ruined my life, because that was the point at which I said, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Leaves of Grass more than anything.
Interesting. Whitman used to come to the Universalist National Memorial Church, the first church that I served as a called minister. And I was so proud of that. And then I found out that actually he loved to go visiting churches. So apparently all of the churches that were around, he would go visit, but he didn't join any of them. He just would go visiting.
But I think he thought of himself as a universalist. He was certainly allied with the Transcendentalists. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a Unitarian minister, was an early supporter of Whitman. Whitman sent Emerson a copy of the first edition of Leaves of Grass in 1855. A paperback copy. Some of them were paper bound and some of them were bound in elaborately stamped green cloth. But apparently the copy that was sent to Emerson is still around. It's in some university collection somewhere. But Emerson cooled on his enthusiasm for Whitman. Upon first reading the original edition of Leaves of Grass, he said, "I greet you at the threshold of a great career." And this was in the 1850s. And in the 1870s or 80s, he said, "I expected Whitman to write the songs of a nation, not the inventories."
Wow. Ouch. Well,
However,
Emerson was hard on his friends.
Well, I guess he could be. However, I really do feel, when I was in high school, my other big favorite was T.S. Eliot, who's somewhat fallen out of favor now, but he's still a favorite of mine. looking back, I think those were great people to have as literary idols because they were sufficiently different from one another that I could not fall too far under the spell of either one. And then there were modern poets, especially two that I had the honor to study with later. The former U.S. Poet Laureate Charles Simic, whose work I love, and Galway Kinnell, with whom I took a class at the Poetry Center in New York in 1982. Galway is a great poet. He was also a very, very nice man. And when he passed away in, I think, 2015, I grieved as I would for a friend. I loved his work, but I also knew the man, and he was genuinely a great man as well as a great writer. He will be missed.
So does anyone else have any questions for Bob before we wrap up tonight? Judith. Oh, yeah. Judith? Oh, good. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, there she is. Okay.
Yeah. I would.
Hey, I like the raised hand. That's new to me.
Yes, it works if you're not otherwise visual. I would really love to hear the Dollhouse poem again.
Oh, yeah, I can do that. One other thing I have to say to somebody. Courtney Young Law. I don't know whether there you are.
Hello, Bob.
Do you realize that when Chris asked me to do a birthday poem for you, I told him that I would not count that against the 3 poems that you'd bought at the church auction. So you still have one if you like.
Thank you. I have a question for you after this, but I want to hear the Dollhouse poem again, but I want to ask you a question about the beautiful poems that you have written for us.
Okay, I'm getting the thing back up on my phone. Here we go. Dollhouse, in memory of Patricia Lewis Smith, 1953 to 2005. The tiny rooms, immaculately furnished, stood for the home we never could afford. The roll-top desk, the copper cookware burnished and hanging neatly, each embroidered word on the stamp-sized sampler hung above the couch, the bed with its bright quilt. In miniature were gathered here the dreams she could not touch. Her dollhouse dreams brought out the best in her. These days, her ashes stain a windowsill no larger than a matchbook. She is gone. But in these things she loved, there lingers still some essence rescued from oblivion. Each elfin fixture resonates with loss, and grief's the only tenant of this house. You know, when I gave an online reading last week, a little over 2 weeks ago, actually, a little less than 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago tomorrow, I included the Dollhouse poem because I had dug it out for this presentation. And I thought, well, I haven't done that one for a long time. Let's just do it. But one of the things that I do to make sonnets sound natural is, I don't know whether all of you know this, but there's more than one particular kind of rhyme. What we usually think of as rhyme is exact rhyme, but the Dollhouse is a Shakespearean sonnet, just as the Shakespeare sonnet is. And the concluding couplet is, each elfin fixture resonates with loss, and grief's the only tenant of this house. Loss and house actually do rhyme. Now, if I were really on top of my game, I'd be able to tell you what kind of rhyme that is. But there are It's the OS sounds in both words. There are exact rhymes, there are slant rhymes, there are off rhymes, there are skewed rhymes, and even after 50 years, I'm darned if I know what all that stuff means, but I know enough about it to be able to use it. And by not rhyming exactly all the time, I have a little bit more latitude. I'd like to be able to write a sonnet that reads like a free verse poem so that you're reacting to what's being said and to the strength of the language and the images rather than to the form.
Mm.
Plus, I love the word elfin in that second to last line.
I do too. Courtney, you want to ask your question?
Yes. Well, I did have the great pleasure of purchasing the poems from Bob at the auction last year, and we will use that third one, I promise.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you knew that although I've done three poems, the one that Chris requested I write for you, I didn't count among that. He offered to pay too, but then I felt I'd be too much under the gun if he were paying for it. I wasn't sure I'd be able to finish it.
Well, I love the poems that you write about your late wife. They often bring me to tears when I read them on Facebook. If you're on Facebook and you're not following Bob, you should, because you'll get a lovely dose of poetry, and they're really moving. But I was curious about your process for those of you who don't know me, I have two kids, and they both had milestone birthdays this year. My daughter turned 10, and then my son turned 13. And so I asked Bob to write a poem for each of them. And then my husband surprised me by asking Bob to write a poem for me for my birthday, which was truly one of the most amazing gifts. The 10 and the 13-year-old weren't quite as moved as I was, but you even alluded to that, Bob, in the poem that you wrote for my 10-year-old, that she will appreciate it more over time, which I think she already knows is true.
I think that probably is true.
And I wanted to know, because it's so clear the way that you capture, your wife, and then the characters for the fiction poems that you write, or I assume that they're fiction about, the
Calamity, the frontier town in Kansas.
Yes. But I was so moved and interested in how you took these snippets about my kids and whom you've never had the opportunity to meet yet, which I hope we get to fix one day soon.
Well, I hope so too.
And I'm just curious how you did that.
Okay, there are two things basically that I did, and part of it is down to you, because you and both of your kids and your husband, Chris, have all been wonderful. If somebody were going to buy my services as a poet at the church auction, I'm lucky that it is you, because what I did was I responded when you told me that you wanted, I think the poem for your daughter was the first one. I responded by saying that I needed all of the information that you could possibly send me about her, including at least one photograph of her, because even if I didn't mention how she looked in the poem, the photograph would give me a sense of her. And your family has been marvelous in that they really did exactly what I wanted. They deluged me with information, which was the ideal thing, because you sit down to write a poem like this and you know that you won't use everything that you've got, but you have enough information that depending upon what you can manage to get to fit when you're writing the poem, you can make choices among things that you will say or not say. Now, structurally, I gave myself a little bit of a crutch in that I don't know whether you noticed this, but all three of the poems that I wrote for your family are in blank verse, which means that they don't rhyme, but they do have that iambic pentameter rhythm, ba-bump, 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 ba-bump.
Yes.
Perhaps you'd rather have a superpower, for instance, right? And what that did was it gave me kind of a scaffolding to hang the writing on. A college friend of mine, who's a very fine writer herself, complained that the birthday poem I wrote for you at Chris's request contained too many of the sorts of things one would expect to say on such an occasion. And I told her that the lines that she objected to were undoubtedly those that Chris had requested specifically that I include. But, you can't do anything about that.
That's probably true. You got to blame me for that.
But nevertheless, there are certain restrictions when you do a poem like that. And what I was aiming for was twofold. I wanted something that I thought that the recipients especially and your family as a whole would like, but I also wanted things that I thought would stand as serious poems, and I think they do.
Yes, thank you. They're beautiful.
Well, thank you very much.
So, Bill, it looks like you have your hand up, and I think we're coming up on the hour, so I think your question will be our last tonight.
I don't know how much time we have, but since we were talking about the poems that you wrote for Courtney, and since we don't know them, it would be nice if you happen to have them handy, if you could read them and we have an idea of what you were talking about.
They're relatively long, but I can see if I can find one. Let me see.
It's like an epic birthday poem? It's not just a poem. It's not a sonnet. It's like the Iliad?
Neither. It's sort of in between.
Oh my gosh.
It's for an
she's got
epic
it
woman,
handy.
so you couldn't just get away with a non-epic poem.
So I will just say,
Well, there we go. Let me see if I can.
Well, Bob,
Chris
Courtney
did
has
have
it
it
right
printed,
there.
and I have it in my office.
Oh, maybe
Do you want to
Well,
read it?
Well,
You
the
wanna
one
read
for
it?
Karina, is my favorite. But I mean,
The one for Karina is my favorite too, actually, but I don't know. I'm trying to find it.
why? Courtney could read it.
Sure, I'll read. So this is called The Road Ahead. This is one for me on my birthday last year, or in 2021. It's called The Road Ahead, a birthday poem for Courtney Younglaw. Birthdays are more sedate as we grow older. Still celebrations, but increasingly reflections on the things we leave behind. Glimpses, perhaps, of what is yet to come. It's been a long and convoluted journey from Texas to the San Francisco Bay, by way of places as diverse as London, the glittering profusion of Las Vegas, the patient silences around Camp Mather, and Santorini in the blue Aegean. You've left your mark on hallowed universities, cheering their football teams with fierce devotion, and all the while retained your lifelong love for the old ghosts inhabiting country music. Itself a genre much concerned with roads, knowing the saddest melodies cut deepest, the way the truest stories resonate between the covers of heartbroken novels. The fire of social justice lit your way, shaping your course, allowing you to find mentors and cherished heroines in the likes of Elizabeth Warren and Cassandra Brene Brown. And you turn your convictions into actions with gentle firmness and determination, whether demanding diversity and inclusion or advocating for the collective good. I guess it isn't really so surprising you cultivate profound, enduring friendships, or that, in spite of daily challenges, you're also a devoted wife and mother. Embrace this birthday as a fragile blossom right in the center of a watercolor, depicting a vast landscape of bluebonnets, the thin horizon blunted at the edges, where sunrise pales a cobalt summer sky, the road ahead just indistinct enough to retain an element of wonder.
Ooh, I love
that's
it. I
pretty
love
good.
that ending. That is. And I love the piece about country music, too.
Well,
It's like-
what I did, and Courtney's family, Courtney, Chris, and both of their kids have been great about this, is I said, I want to know everything about Courtney that I might be able to use. And your love of country music was one thing. And of course, I immediately thought, if we're going to talk about life as a road, that a lot of country songs are about traveling and that I should use that. I actually think the one for Karina was the best of the three as well, but I can't manage to put my hand right on it now.
Well, you know what I'll promise? I just took a screenshot of who's here tonight. And if either the, Law family or you, Bob, can find it, I will send it to everybody. How's that?
Okay, that's fine. I'm sure that I will. I just have to look.
I can definitely find it, Bob, and send it to
Vanessa if you would. Yeah.
Great. Well,
could you hear those were blank verse?
I guess.
Could you hear the rhythm in those, that they were blank verse?
Yeah.
I think it carries you through. So that's part of it, right? When it's just sort of carries you through like a,
It's certainly meant to.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's what I call flow when I see a poem and it moves me on.
Mm. Mm. Well, thank you all for being here. And of course, the biggest thank you to you, Bob, for coming and sharing with us this piece of your life and your artistry and, your mark on the world that you serve and serve with love, because I think most of us here also love poetry, but it's just lovely to hear the depth of understanding and the journey that took you through it, and to get to also sit with some gorgeous poetry as part of the evening.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And
so
thank
everybody,
you all for coming.
Great. I'm going to blow out our chalice and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody.